Hello, and welcome to episode 159 of Prose. This week, meet a king among beggars, a beggar among kings, and revisit a theft in the land of Dole-Aishara. To start this week, I do have to send out a special shout out. This episode is in honor of my mother. It is her birthday tomorrow, so hey, happy birthday, Mom. As usual, I would love you all to go to our website, that is prosepodcast.com, to go check out all the swag and old episodes there. Not to mention be able to put in a story if you would like it read on air here. Please follow on social media and give me a shout there. I love interacting with all of you. Most importantly, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, rate and review the show, because that's really what gives this thing legs. And I love to hear your feedback. Thanks so much in advance. But for now, let's get to the tale, shall we? This week, we have the Mendicant King and Apple Thief Charlie. Enjoy. The Mendicant King, an original short story by Jared I. McGee. Asal's excitement was getting the better of her. After weeks of being on the road, she couldn't believe that she was almost there. The Hall of the Mendicant King. If someone had asked her even a month ago, Asal would have laughed at them, called them a believer in tall tales meant to widen children's eyes. Anyone in Dole-Aishara would have said the same. The maps beyond the farthest border of the kingdoms and the collective's lands were nothing but conjecture. On the map itself, it was black. But coins minted in the name of the Mendicant Kings had been filtering into Dole-Aishara for centuries, as had a steady flow of merchants who swore on their lives that they did trade in that far-off land well beyond the comforts and the refuse of the city and its said to be crumbling holdings. Even with this evidence trickling into the city in a slow but steady drip, Asal and anyone with any head on their shoulders doubted these Mendicant Kings. The very idea of a monarchy that was held accountable wholly by its people was absurd to them. From what little information was around, most of which could easily be attributed to myth or hyperbole, the Mendicant King's wealth was given from the peoples of those lands, not taken or earned. Rather, the line of beggar monarchs were said to be the gods' chosen ones, there in the land of the many to be worshipped, and so the people, high and low, common and noble, gave to their rulers. If the kingdom wanted to maintain power and position in the world, they saw it necessary to ensure the kings and their ilk had comfort and finery and wealth. The Mendicant Kings dripped with gold and jewels, their chief style a combination of black sable furs laced with purple cloths and a healthy embedding of deep green emeralds, artery red rubies, starburst opals, and the clearest diamonds one could ever find. The Mendicant Kings and their families were said to glitter while they walked, more so than any star in a night sky. They banqueted every night. They rode the finest horses. They kept the largest menageries for fun and the largest armies for strength. To Asal, that was just too much to swallow. In Dole-Aishara, everyone was out for themselves, especially the nobles and the uppity merchant classes. It was dog-eat-dog in the streets, and most barely made any attempt at hiding the open hunger for more, no matter how much they already had. With the merchants and nobility at one another's throats, the army starting to get ideas that they might be better rulers, and whispers of a growing cult around a man-thing calling itself the Chadic, Dole-Aishara was what Asal might have thought the opposite of the Mendicant kingdom to be. If someone showed weakness in that ancient city-state, the masses would eat them alive. Most especially someone from the noble classes. She could only imagine how they would quite literally tear a noble into pieces and nail those pieces onto the bridgeway's arches to send a message to anyone so foolish as to beg from beggars and thieves and merchants. So when the herald had come saying she was from the Mendicant king, and she was dripping with gold and jewels laid atop black sable furs laced with purple cloths and a healthy embedding of deep green emeralds, artery red rubies, starburst opals, and the clearest diamonds one could ever find. Asal and the entirety of the city were agog. Myth had come strolling into the city and was shouting, as heralds tend to do, that the great beggar king from afar was in search of a queen. Supposedly, his chosen betrothed from another neighboring kingdom had died suddenly, or so rumor had it. In the tales, the kings married their own kin to keep their bloodline pure, but the herald quashed that rumor rather quickly, calling it a barbarous practice unworthy of noble peoples. This rankled the nobles of Dole-Aishara to no end, as they themselves would marry their cousins and, in times now long past, their siblings. But the Mendicant king was looking for new, virile blood, supple blood that ran with the vigor of Dole-Aishara. Asal had never been much of anyone in the city. Her mother was a washerwoman, albeit for one of the merchants who had become all but nobility in their ever-growing wealth. Her father had been an early merchant himself, casting out to those blank spots on the map and going headlong into the sea as well, seeking wealth and a better life for his small family. He died protecting a shipload of ice peppers from the frozen deserts, a cargo that would have changed his fortunes. His business partner, a man named Phineas Markle, had taken in all the wealth that came from that ship's safe return. This was his right on the high seas and in the realm of business. But to his credit, he had made sure that Asal's mother had work, and he had continued to be a patron of hers, in his own way, keeping a vein of overpayment coming their way, always. With that extra money, her mother had secured Asal a place in one of the private schools that accepted commoners. Asal had learned proper speech and noble etiquette. She had learned reading, arithmetic, dancing, dining, embroidery, science, cartography, alchemy, and so much more. So, when the time came for the herald's ball, not only could she attend the open event, which was allowing women of all sorts, from all classes and places in Dole-Aishara to attend, she had every ability to fit in among the lowest of the low, almost all the way to the stratosphere with the highest of the high. The ball was like any other ball, though Asal had never attended a ball before, so she could only assume that all the merchants' daughters and nobility were murmuring the truth with a little disdain. She thought it was amazing, an almost otherworldly experience. The food was rich, the wine was bold. The music was the latest, played by the best musicians. More than anything, though, Asal was wide-eyed at the herald herself. That a woman could hold such a place of power under the Mendicant king buggered the Dole-Aishara imagination, not the least of which Asal's very own. The herald was dressed in the same resplendent walking display of wealth in which she had arrived. But now Asal could see it for herself. Moreover, the herald was surrounded by 6 men cut out of shadow. They were all black. Their skin, their eyes, their teeth, their mouths, every little bit of them was black as night. Not the black of the men from the southern reaches. This had nothing to do with melanin. No. These men had the features of peoples from all over the wider world. But they had tattooed every bit of themselves down to the very whites of their eyes. These were the dark soldiers that also came in whispers from myth and legend and folk tale, from nightmares and threats against the dark. Apparently, the Mendicant kingdom had heard tales of the rising unrest in Dole-Aishara and did not want to risk its herald to even the slightest possibility of danger. These men of coal in armor of ink did not leave anything to the imagination. They moved and breathed as men born to kill. The herald was quite safe, even amid the growing unease of the land, while under the protection of these living shadows. The herald had sought Asal out, not she her. Asal had been waiting for her turn to dance, patiently, sipping her iced wine punch and speaking with a gaggle of wealthy merchants' daughters and a smattering of poor merchants' daughters doing their best to pretend they were the former. The herald had been no nonsense, asking each girl a quick-fire 3 questions each, and she had quickly focused in on Asal. 3 more questions saw Asal taken by the hand of the herald and escorted to the dais where they could speak a bit more privately. At least an hour passed, but Asal could not wrap her mind around what precisely they spoke about looking back. Her family, her father, how her father had died, her education, her aspirations, her wildest dreams. What she had heard of the long lines of the Mendicant kings. Most of what she could remember centered around her ideas and affiliations with political groups, and what she felt about the economic inequalities that were so apparent in Dole-Aishara. Asal was told to speak plainly, and she did. She told the herald of how she thought the wealth should be more evenly distributed, how the starving should have more food than the wealthy did gold, how the places and spaces of the once great land of Dole-Aishara could be great once more, if only the powerful took just a little less and gave a little more. After their talk, the herald had called an early and abrupt end to the ball, declaring to everyone present that she had found the new queen of the Mendicant kingdom, designating Asal. The nobles were aghast. The merchants' daughters were livid. The poor common girls were elated. Those poor present hooted and hollered at one of their own being scooped up to be a noble herself. Asal didn't know what to think. Her head spun. The next 24 hours flew by. In but a day, Asal had together what little she owned, say farewell to her friends and coworkers, and, most difficult of all, bid her mother goodbye. The herald swore they would call for her mother after a time, but the Mendicant king and his high council would have to approve of Asal first, and then approve of Asal's mother. The herald said that the high council was not easily convinced, so it might take longer than Asal would like. This would be an audition of sorts to start. Oddly to Asal's ears, the herald told her that the council was made up of people from all cuts of cloth, from the poorest and most indigent all the way up to the king's own brother. Odd to her ears? Certainly. Better to make her case to? Most definitely. Still, she hated to leave her mother for this chance at a chance. But, through tears and hugs, her mother encouraged her to go. After weeks of traveling then, striking out past the places where the maps were blank and fiction and imagination alone reigned for the Dole-Aisharan people, when Asal saw the massive glimmering walls of the Mendicant king's capital city, she began to cry. Not weep, no. But she let her calm tears flow down her cheeks, letting out her heartache at leaving her mother, her anxiety for this forthcoming judgment, the discomfort of being surrounded by the dark soldiers at every turn for almost a month, even when she had to make water or add to the soil in the woods, her excitement at potentially changing her and her mother's stars forever. All of that and more. The tears contained all of that and more. Even though she could see the grand white walls that gleamed like ivory that was embedded with jewels and laced with gold and silver, Asal knew the grand entrance into the city would still be hours yet. They were tall enough to be seen from miles away after all. She tried to settle herself back in, so she could stop the tears, calm herself. Puffy cheeks and red eyes would not do to meet a king, even a beggar king. Asal quieted herself by thinking about all those tales that she had heard, many of which from her own father when he would put her to bed. Tales of a man who ruled a kingdom but was a pauper, a man who was both beggar and king, the poorest of a realm who was wholly dependent on his people to make him richer than the gods themselves. Hours still, but only hours, until she came face to face with a legend come to life, with the Mendicant king. Thank you for listening to The Mendicant King, an original short story by me, Jared I. McGee. For our second story this week, we're going to do a quick flashback to a previous tale from the land of Dole-Aishara. Please stick around for a little bit more of this fantastical excitement. Apple Thief Charlie, an original short story by Jared I. McGee. Execution was a foregone conclusion at this point. In Dole-Aishara, thieving was a capital offense. Charles could hear the rumble of the gathering, the black felt skies and strumming thunder therein mirroring what the council would have already no doubt decided. Today would be a day of darkness and violence. He did steal the apples. There was no denying it. These particular apples were not special, though. They were not made of precious metals, gems, or sky stones. They were not the seed fathers or core mothers of some royal crop line. Those were kept in the Nurum vaults far away and secured against people like Charles. They were not the spoils of some celebrated war on men or titans. They were not divine playthings responsible for shifting the cosmos, like some mythological apples were purported to be. These apples were just apples. Pedestrian, normal, edible. Edible being key. Of the 4 golden fruits, Charles had eaten only one, the smallest of the pilfered quartet. He was hungry after all. That is why he stole them. He had to find food for himself and his younger siblings, Harash, his 5-year-old brother, and Anush, his 4-year-old sister. The stolen fruit hadn't tasted special because it wasn't special. Hundreds of thousands of bushels of such apples were thrown away as trash at the end of trade each day. Some bruised, some browning, some simply proving to be too cumbersome for a merchant or shopkeep to harbor or transport. No one ever considered giving them to the poor masses of the fields, though. This ruined bounty. Such uppity dreaming was scoffed at. Why give food to these beggars who could not pay for it and who did not work for it? Such practices would instill laziness and continued destitution. Not giving away the excess from trade days was downright patriotic. They were looking out for those fields residents that might otherwise be seduced into a life of half-lidded ease. The fields. The name of the litter of makeshift shelters that the poorest of the poor of Dole-Aishara made in the sewer district was a bit too grand, a bit too hopeful when compared to the stark realities found therein. At the center of the fields was Dole-Aishara, the vast and writhing man-made catch-all lake and sewage port. When the city's offal and wastewater wriggled its way to Dole-Aishara from the increasingly plenteous sewage canals, where it gathered and then monthly was flushed into the greater Ardon River through a series of dams, dikes, and locks. Because of that monthly practice, the last day of the lunar cycle was always a big busy day in the slums of Dole-Aishara. Yes, the fumes from Dole-Aishara were so painful that the fields became almost uninhabitable on that last day. But the hope of the renewal to come and what that first day of the new lunar cycle would bring invigorated the residents there. Even if they did know from grim experience that the refuse would continue to flow into their home, stinking and fetid and leaching from them and their loved ones' health, happiness, and everything else good of which they dreamed. Charles had seen all too often his fellow citizens picking out fruits and vegetables and animal scraps from the flows of the sewage channels. Most of the fields being so desperate for food that they would happily accept the cast-off from the flows before they reached the larger cesspool of disease and danger. Once the trash of the city made it to Dole-Aishara, it was lost. So, people planned plucking parties to try to get the best trash before it became inedible or unusable. There was no good way to go about planning such a plucking party, however. The sewage channels ran about in strange spoke and wheel patterns all throughout Dole-Aishara, so discarded scraps would never pop up in the same places. If a merchant tossed a crate of shine fruit from the trade district into the canals on a Monday,
it might pop up in the southeastern corner of the fields on Tuesday. If a shopkeep upturned a barrow of ox bones that same day at the same place, the canals might take the bones to the northwest corner of the fields that same day. There was just no predicting the path of the tarnished treasures. So the people sent their youngest, their nimblest, their most idle, their most learned, to fish from the stinking streams of Dole-Aishara. This is why the 3 remaining apples were such a treasure to Charles. He had tasted the unremarkable apples and thought them unremarkable, but only because he'd once been paid one as a day's wages working up in the city proper. That apple had been split between himself, his parents, and his 2 older siblings, all of whom had died of disease and malnutrition before Harash and Anush were old enough to have a strong memory of them. That first unsoiled apple had been the greatest thing he'd ever tasted in his life. The memory of it seemed to outsize actual apples, as he had experienced, but that memory was golden as those 4 apples, something to remain unassailed, something that helped him continue through the harshness of life. Harash and Anush had never tasted unsullied food before. These apples would make a golden memory for them. Not only that, but the little ones would get an entire fruit to themselves. The 3rd remaining apple would either be split up and sold for a handsome sum that would see Charles and his siblings taken care of for a time, or split among the 3. Maybe he would cut up and dry the 4th and final apple. Then, it would last longer and potentially serve as a meal later on down the line. If there was to be a later on down the line. Charles shook the torrent of thoughts from his head and continued to make his way among the growing shadows. He had long since escaped from Dole-Aishara's main complexes and trade district. He was now in the odd rings of merchant-class homes and shops that acted as a buffer zone between the fields and the handsomer parts of the city. Seeing the wealth that even this supposed underclass held shook Charles and made him angry. Angry at the unfairness of it all. Just 1 week of one man's wages from the middle classes would help Harush, Anush, and he live like royals for a year in the fields. Some of the men in the fields had begun to speak about this inequality. At first they had whispered of rising up against these selfish pigs of Dole-Aishara. Then they began to speak about it openly in the streets. Recently, they had begun to shout it while standing on crates in the makeshift squares of the shanty kingdom there on the edges of life in Dole-Aishara. These loud firebrands called themselves the Resurrected. After all, the fields existed outside of life, did it not? The peoples therein were the same as the dead. Forgotten, buried away, only thought of in abstract terms, both there and not there at all. The only difference was that the dead of Dole-Aishara were venerated and remembered and given markers. The people of the fields were actively forgotten, and the forgetting was relished by the upper classes. The growing unrest is how and why the council moved so fast today. They had already been pushing back against these curs trying to get uppity and upend the natural order of the world. A dog needs whipping now and again to keep it in line, they reasoned. When the calls of "Thief!" had echoed through the bazaar, the authorities moved quickly. For once, Charles was glad of the council's fell powers. Their anger manifested itself in the blackening skies, and those charred clouds let him know that there was no time to tarry or creep. He'd been as fast as the lightning that was beginning to streak above head as he made his way out of Dole-Aishara. Despite all of his meandering thoughts, he'd made it out of the midsection of the city and entered the fields. To his surprise, people cheered him as he slowed his pace to a jog. Several men who wore the newly minted uniform of the Resurrected, a simple browned and mottled scrap of cloth around their abdomen, clapped him on the back or chuffed at him like the lions of the plains. Rather quickly, Charles realized that the news of his theft had made it home before he did. Rather quickly, Charles became worried that this might mean that his time was finished, that the authorities would have him in no time. However, in the time it took him to have these realizations, the people of the fields quashed his fears with more cheers, well-wishing, and whispers of, "We'll never let them have you, apple thief." Charles finally came to one of the few openings between shanties in the fields that acted as a square. Umasa Grounds, it was called. The gathering of people was so thick there that he halted. Gerald, an older grizzled vet of some forgotten war with a neighboring city-state, heeled out and away from the crowd. Everyone called Gerald Dodger, though, because he could dodge steel and trouble and hunger and slighted women and, most importantly to Charles right now, thief catchers. Dodger extended a hand of friendship, which Charles eagerly accepted, clasping the man's forearm where Dodger did the same to him in return. To his surprise, Dodger then lifted his arm in the air, still clinging to his forearm, declaring in a far more clarion voice than Charles would have ever thought could come from such an old, wiry one. "This is Apple Thief Charlie, the man who dared, the taker of gold. Today he struck the first poignant blow for the resurrection. Today, my children, begins our rebirth." The uproar of cheers and shouts and exultations hurt Charles's ears. For some reason, he was meant to be a hero for the resurrected now? An icon? Is that what was going on? Apple Thief Charlie. What a strange moniker. No one called him Charlie. He touched the inner pocket of his coat to make sure the apples were safe and secure. As he saw bright faces begin to turn dark in their shouting against the people and the powers of Dole-Aishara, he scanned the crowd for Harash and Anush. No, of course. They wouldn't be there. They were good, well-mannered children, and he told them to leave their hovel for no reason until he returned. As the crowd continued to swell, and their chants continued to grow louder and more sinister and more grandiose, Charles, his arm now free of Dodger's grasp, made his way quietly out of the Umasa grounds and back toward his home. It was dinner time, and he needed to feed his family. Thank you for listening to Apple Thief Charlie, an original short story by me, Jared I. McGee.
That does it this week for Prose. I do hope you enjoyed the new tale in Dole-Aishara and the little reminder of how it all started. I'd like to say once again, happy birthday, Mom. Please do note that all sounds you have heard behind all of this come from YouTube's free music library, as well as freesound.org. Everything being used is being used under CC 0 1.0 public domain dedication licenses. And now it's time for us to go out into the world for 2 weeks. While you're out there and doing what you do, please love those around you, tell them that you do, and embrace this life as it is, always stranger than fiction. Thank you so much for listening.